April 27th, 1884. My darling Katie, I don't know how to write you this letter, but I know I must, for the consequences of it concerns us both. I've only been in Frisco for one day, but knew I needed to write you right away. Yet even now, I'm uncertain as to whether I'll be able to afford to post this. You see, contrary to what I had planned upon my arrival in this waterless, heathenistic wilderness, I'm not a married woman, nor do I have any notion of becoming so. I will start at the beginning, dearest, as none of this will make a stitch of sense to you otherwise. After what happened in Chicago, I never dreamt I'd find further adventure on my journey west. But it seems trouble has followed me all the way to Frisco, and in the worst way. We changed trains in Salt Lake City and boarded the Utah Central Railway before heading southwest toward Frisco. We'd been traveling for half the day and were just leaving a town called Leamington when Mr. Hickman and I made our way to the dining car for lunch. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very pleasant lunch, as I finally found the opportunity to tell him I was on my way to Frisco to be married. He congratulated me, but then excused himself and left the car in such an abrupt manner. I was left wondering how on earth I could have offended him. So much has happened since meeting him, Katie. Mr. Matthew Hickman is the most excellent of gentlemen, and the last person I wish to harm in any way. I had just made up my mind to go after him and make amends if I could, when the train suddenly lurched and the wheels began to squeal, making the most ghastly racket. The next moment, several gunshots were heard. The dining car broke into utter madness. When I finally managed to enter the next car, rather than finding Mr. Hickman, as I hoped, I found myself staring down the barrel of a pistol. A masked bandit shouted for me to get on the floor. I refused, of course. I was wearing my magenta velvet and taffeta polonaise. I wasn't about to destroy dozens of hours of some of the finest pleating and embroidery work I've ever done simply because a meter like himself wanted what was in my handbag. I told him as much, as I tend to do, of course. If I'd been carrying more than Mr. Gambit's dreadful ring, dearest, I might not have been so brazen. But I ask you, what better way to avoid our first fight as husband and wife than to have his hideous ring stolen? That's when I realized the bandit was just standing there staring at me. I watched his eyes change from flintly steel to utter bewilderment. Then he lowered his gun. At the time, I imagined it was because he'd never had a lady stand up to him before. How wrong I was, Katie. How wrong I was. The bandit's hesitation gave me a moment to examine him more closely, and I noticed a strange moon-shaped scar on the top of his right wrist. It was outlined by several small dots where stitches had obviously, and very clumsily, been employed to sew up the wound. Before I noticed any more, Mr. Hickman burst into the car from the opposite end, a pistol in his hand, yelling for the bandit and his 4 other comrades to drop their weapons. The moment the bandits saw Mr. Hickman's Pinkerton's badge winking at them from his other hand, they blew past me, scrambling over each other to try and get off the train. To tell you the truth, I was just as shocked as they were. Not once in all our conversations since leaving Chicago had Mr. Hickman even hinted at being a Pinkerton agent. Mr. Hickman approached me then, asking if I was all right, when I assured him I was. We returned to our seats and spent the rest of our trip to Frisco in awkward silence. A Pinkerton agent, Katie. What would he think of me if he knew about Daw? What would Daw think of if he were alive? My confession, compounded by Mr. Hickman's revelation, had all but destroyed the easy, friendly manner that existed between us since Chicago. I don't mind admitting to you that it significantly dampened my spirits. I've since discovered I quite enjoy the company of Mr. Hickman and his lovely Texan-bred manners more than any other man of my acquaintance. When we finally reached Frisco, my spirits were even more dampened when I saw how much Sylvester had exaggerated the town's attractions. It's nothing but dust and wind and wide open space out here. Katie! They do have glorious sunsets, and it's spring, so there's a little bit of beauty. I'll give them that. But there's hardly a tree in sight. And the wind is always blowing. There isn't any water for drinking or bathing either. The water that is here must be freighted in from the neighboring town of Milford, which is 15 miles to the east. You must purchase water by the bucket. Which leads me to the next deplorable thing about this place. Because of the lack of water, everyone quenches their thirst at the saloons, of which there are 22. If that weren't enough, there is every sort of gambling hall, brothel, and opium den a person in pursuit of debauchery could wish for. The entire town is rampant with the vilest of the deadly sins on full display to offend every living creature innocently walking down the boardwalk. It's a certificate pit of lawless barbarism. And what do you think greeted me almost the moment my boots hit the dusty street? A lynching! Front and center on Main Street for all to see, as though it were the main event of a traveling show. There was no sheriff or deputy in sight. There isn't any law in Frisco, dear heart. I learned this firsthand. And yet, I still haven't told you the worst part of my story. After retrieving my trunk for me and before parting, Mr. Hickman said he'd feel a lot better if he saw me safely to my intended's residence, particularly with the lynching happening right there on Main Street. I wasn't about to refuse him. We found our way in silence, and when we reached Sylvester's residence, a grand wooden house built along one of the foothills here, at least he didn't exaggerate that, Mr. Hickman and I said our goodbyes. I don't mind telling you how reluctant I was to see him go. He is the most interesting person I've ever met. He's all the manly ruggedness one would expect from a man in his profession. Yet he's also kind and funny, gentle and chivalrous. He has all the qualities I feel a man should have. You know, I've always believed love in marriage was simply a matter of luck, and that one could build a perfectly adequate life with someone merely respected. After all, that's what Da and Mama did. However, as I watched Mr. Hickman striding back down Main Street in his sure-footed way, I was almost certain my life would never feel adequate again if he wasn't in it. But I'm nothing if not a woman of my word. So I stuffed those growing feelings back down into the deep corners of my heart, then forced myself to knock on Sylvester's door. He wasn't home. His housekeeper told me he'd been away at the mine all day. She showed me to the room prepared for me. It was immaculate, all done up in deep wine velvets and brocade carnelian satins. Everything dripped with gold fringe. Between you and me, it was as gaudy and opulent as Sylvester's wedding ring. I busied myself by changing into my wedding clothes and attending to my toilette for an hour or so. I even allowed the maid Sylvester hired just for me to help me into my new corset and gown. Most wouldn't bother with such extravagance for an unconventional wedding like mine, but if I was going to be the only dressmaker in Frisco, I wanted my skill with the dress to be on full display from the start. After all, there's no harm in churning the rumor mill right away. When I finished dressing my hair, I looked at my reflection, and Katie, how I wish you could have seen me. You know I'm not vain about my looks. We both know you got all the beauty our parents had to offer, which is why I don't mind telling you that the sight of me in my wedding finery was grand indeed. I was just wishing Mr. Hickman had been able to see me like this when I heard a man's voice below stairs. I scolded myself for having such unruly thoughts again and readied myself to meet my groom. The housekeeper was sent up to fetch me. I followed her down the stairs. With each step toward the parlor, I imagined what Sylvester might look like. All the while, I'm ashamed to say, hoping he had Mr. Hickman's lovely blue eyes and dimples. When I finally met Mr. Gambit, I wasn't disappointed by his appearance. He is handsome, medium height, with sandy blonde hair and brown eyes. He looks younger than I imagined, and his smile is pleasant. He appeared to be even more nervous than I was, for his eyes dashed all around, looking everywhere but at me. I, on the other hand, only felt as though I'd swallowed a fresh bowl of Mrs. Frisbee's garden worms. The preacher was in the parlor as well, so Sylvester offered me his arm. And that, my darling Katie, is precisely when all our plans came crashing down around me. As we entered the parlor, Mr. Gambit reached up to adjust his collar. I glanced over at him, trying to smile and set his obvious nerves at ease. That's when I saw it. There, on his wrist, in the exact same place as the bandits from the train, was that moon-shaped scar. I looked again, just to be certain, and sure enough, it was surrounded by those sloppy stitch scars. Well, Katie, you'll be proud of me. I didn't throw a single thing at him. That is not until he insisted that if I wasn't going to marry him, I would have to pay back every cent he paid to get me out here. Only then did I throw that hideous ring at him. I'm proud to say it hit him on the cheekbone and bounced off and shattered a mirror hanging over the mantel behind him. The crash was immensely satisfying, and I hope from the top of my head to the tips of my boots that it was only a precious and extremely valuable family heirloom. Thank you very much. After that, I apologized to the preacher for startling him and excused myself. I asked the maid to pack up my things and have them ready to deliver to an address I would provide as soon as had found lodging, and then I left. When I got down the street a little way, I didn't know where to go. Had I not been in such a curl-off, I would have noticed how dark it was getting, and would have gotten myself to the nearest hotel as soon as possible. But, dearest, all I could think of was you. How am I going to get you west now? That was the only thought swirling through my mind until I became increasingly aware that I had wandered into an especially unsavory part of town. You and I have both found ourselves in the more wretched spots of Mott Haven and New York's surrounding slums from time to time. We've, we've both seen things we wish we hadn't. But, darling, somehow the West is different. There is no law here. The man who draws the fastest is the law. Even now, I'm not certain which road I took that led me to the red light district of Frisco. But when I finally came to myself, I had just tripped over a body in the street. He wasn't dead, thank goodness, but completely soused. In fact, there were inebriated men and scarlet women everywhere. And if they weren't drunk, then they had just wandered out of the various opium dens and brothels lining the street. When some of the women saw me, the poor souls mentioned my ivory silk and started pawing me with their grimy hands. Had I not been so disoriented, I would have politely excused myself and run for it. But I won't trouble you with the baser carnality of it all. Let us just say it was incumbent upon me to remove myself from the vile environment as soon as possible. And, unfortunately, I didn't do it with much dignity or grace. When I was finally free of them and had turned a corner onto a more respectable street, 3 women stepped out of a nearby saloon. They didn't look like the sort I'd just come from, so I asked them for help. Thankfully, they took pity on me and led me inside. Now, Katie, in the 5 years I've spent fitting and sewing dresses for New York debutantes, I've seen some rare beauties. I assure you, however, not one of them holds a candle to these 3 women who came to my rescue. Once I saw them in the light of the saloon, they were dazzling. The most beautiful dark-haired beauties I've ever seen in all my life. They made sure I was all right, and then one of them asked if they could see me home. That's when I found myself blinking back tears and telling them my entire predicament concerning Mr. Gambit. "You came all the way to Frisco to marry Sylvester?" the oldest of the 3 asked. When I nodded, she swore and called me a yellow-bellied swine. It seems I was completely deceived by him and his letters. He is a very wealthy man, one of the Horn silver mine owners. But why rob trains, then? For the thrill of it? I don't understand it. After hearing my plight, the ladies were about to take me over to Milford with them so I could tell my dilemma to the sheriff there. But then I remembered Mr. Hickman. He had never said he was leaving Frisco right away, and I knew I could trust him. So I asked if they might help me find him. I told them he was a Pinkerton. After exchanging a knowing smile, the 3 women assured me they knew him as well, and a finer specimen of manliness they'd never beheld. I was no longer betrothed to Mr. Gambit, so I felt no guilt at all in agreeing with them very heartily. That's when they told me they knew just where to find him. What seemed like only moments later, the women had brought me to a respectable-looking hotel. They then wished me luck, mounted their horses, and rode off. I didn't even have the chance to thank them. When I finally entered the hotel, it didn't take me long to spot Mr. Hickman through the crowded dining parlor. The room fell silent once everyone saw me standing there in my wedding clothes, but I didn't care, because the moment Mr. Hickman saw me, he stood and started toward me. And Katie, there was a look in his eyes I've never seen before. I'm not sure what it means entirely, but I must tell you that when I saw it, I felt overwhelmingly relieved that Mr. Cambit turned out to be a train robber. So, now you have it all, my Katie, the whole strange and peculiar tale of my Western adventure. It hasn't turned out the way we intended at all, but I'm not going to give up hope. There's got to be another way to get you out of New York before the winter. I'll write again as soon as I have a new plan. Your most faithful and loving sister, Lily Clara.